The night had not fallen suddenly, nor had it crept in with the stealth of a shadow. It had simply arrived, the way water finds its level, settling into the spaces between the buildings and filling the streets with a soft, gray stillness. The transition from dusk to darkness was so gradual that there was no single moment in which the light could be said to have gone. It had merely thinned, dispersed, until what remained was a quiet dimness that held the world in a state of suspended calm. The air was cool and still, carrying with it the faint scent of old stone and the accumulated dust of many years. The city, if it could still be called a city, was silent. Not the silence of abandonment, but the silence of deep rest, of a place that had grown comfortable with its own quietness. The streets were empty, the windows dark, and the only movement was the occasional drift of air that stirred nothing but itself. In the heart of this stillness, in a narrow lane that curved between buildings of weathered stone, there stood a doorway. It was not hidden, nor was it prominent. It simply existed, set into the wall of an old structure whose purpose had been forgotten long ago. The doorway was made of stone, a single arch of gray rock that had been worn smooth by the passage of time and the touch of countless hands. The stones were fitted together with a precision that spoke of ancient skill, each piece shaped to sit perfectly against its neighbors without the need for mortar or binding. The surface was cool and slightly rough, textured in a way that suggested it had been carved by tools that no longer existed, shaped by methods that had been lost to the slow erosion of memory. The arch was tall enough for a person to pass through without stooping, wide enough for a single body to move comfortably through its frame. There was no door within the arch, no barrier of wood or iron to block the passage. The space within the doorway was simply empty, filled with the same soft darkness that filled the rest of the lane. But the emptiness was not quite the same. It was denser somehow, more present, as if the air within the arch had weight and substance that the air outside did not possess. The doorway did not glow, it did not hum with power or radiate any visible force. It simply stood, patient and still, as it had stood for more years than anyone could remember. The enchantment that rested upon the doorway was old, woven into the stone so long ago that the memory of its making had faded into legend and then into nothing at all. It was not a spell that had been cast with drama or ceremony, not a magic that required maintenance or renewal. It was simply there, a part of the doorway's nature, as integral to its existence as the grain was to wood or the coolness was to stone. The enchantment did not serve any grand purpose. It did not guard treasure or protect secrets. It did not open pathways to distant lands or grant passage to those who proved themselves worthy. It did nothing so dramatic or useful. The enchantment simply recognized. It listened to the sounds that moved through the air near the doorway, and when it heard certain patterns, certain combinations of syllables that formed the shapes of names, it responded. The response was subtle, almost imperceptible, A gentle shift in the quality of the air, a faint warmth that spread through the stone, a softening of the silence. The doorway did not judge the names it heard. It did not question whether they belonged to the living or the dead, to the powerful or the forgotten. It simply acknowledged them, the way a still pool acknowledges the touch of a falling leaf. The lane where the doorway stood was narrow and curved, lined on both sides by buildings that leaned slightly inward as if weary from the weight of their own age. The cobblestones beneath were smooth and uneven, worn into gentle dips and rises by the passage of feet that had long since ceased their walking. The walls were stone, dark gray and covered in places with a thin layer of moss that grew in the sheltered spaces where moisture gathered. The windows in the walls were few and small, their glass long gone or so darkened by grime that no light could pass through. The lane led from nowhere in particular to nowhere at all, a passage that seemed to exist only for the sake of existing, connecting two streets that were themselves empty and forgotten. There were no signs to mark the lane, no names carved into the walls to suggest what it had once been called. It was simply a space between other spaces, a quiet corridor in the vast, sleeping body of the old city. The doorway was set into the wall on the left side of the lane, about halfway down its length. There was nothing to distinguish it from the stone round it, except for the arch itself and the strange, dense quality of the darkness within. The silence in the lane was profound, a thick and heavy presence that absorbed all sound and held it close. There was no wind to stir the air, no voices to break the stillness, no footsteps to echo against the walls. The world beyond the lane, the city, the countryside, whatever lay in the distance, was muted and remote, as if separated by more than just stone and distance. The silence here was not oppressive. It was not a silence that pressed down or threatened. It was simply the natural state of the place, a quietness so complete that it felt like a kind of presence in itself, a companion that asked for nothing and offered nothing but its own steady calm. The air was cool and still, carrying only the faintest scent of dust and old stone. It was the smell of a place that had not been disturbed in a very long time, a place where the passage of years had smoothed away all the sharp edges and left only the soft, rounded contours of age. The doorway stood in the center of this silence, patient and unchanging, its stone cool to the touch, its darkness deep and unmoving. The enchantment did not sleep, but neither was it alert. It existed in a state of constant, passive awareness, a gentle attention that required no effort and took no rest. It listened to the air around the doorway, to the small vibrations that moved through the stone, to the faint sounds that sometimes drifted down the lane from the streets beyond. Most of what it heard was nothing: the soft settling of dust, the slow expansion and contraction of stone as the temperature shifted, the distant murmur of the world going about its business far away, but occasionally carried on the still air or spoken in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, a name would reach the doorway, and when it did, the enchantment would respond. The response was never dramatic. There was no flash of light, no sound of locks turning, no sudden opening of a passage that had been closed. The stone of the arch would simply grow warmer, a gentle heat that spread slowly through the rock, barely enough to be felt by a hand resting against it. The air within the arch would shift, a subtle movement that suggested the presence of something just beyond sight. The darkness would deepen slightly, becoming richer, more textured, as if layers of shadow were settling into place. And then, after a moment that was neither long nor short, the warmth would fade, the air would still, and the doorway would return to its patient waiting. Names were strange things the enchantment had learned over the long years of its existence. They were not just sounds, though they were that too. They were shapes made of breath and intention, patterns of vibration that carried with them the weight of identity and memory. A name spoken aloud was a recognition, an acknowledgement that someone or something existed, that they had been present in the world and had left their mark, however small, on the fabric of experience. The enchantment did not understand names in the way that a mind might understand them. It had no thoughts, no consciousness that could parse meaning or interpret intent. It simply recognized the patterns, the particular combinations of sounds that formed names, and responded to them in the only way it knew how, with warmth, with a subtle shift in the quality of the air, with a gentle acknowledgement that the name had been heard. It did not matter whether the names belonged to people who were still alive or to those who had passed beyond the reach of breath and speech. It did not matter whether the names were spoken with love or with indifference, with hope or with sorrow. The enchantment recognized them all equally, without judgment or preference, responding to each with the same patient, gentle warmth. The stone of the doorway was cool beneath the touch, smooth and slightly damp, as if it had absorbed some of the moisture from the still air. The surface was not perfectly even. There were small irregularities, tiny variations in texture that could be felt by fingers that moved slowly across the stone. In some places, the rock was worn almost glassy, polished by the countless hands that had touched it over the years. In other places, it retained a slight roughness, a faint graininess that suggested the original texture of the stone before time had smoothed it. The arch was carved with no decoration, no patterns or symbols to indicate its purpose or origin. It was simply stone, shaped into a curve, fitted together with skill, and left to stand. The edges of the arch were softened by age, the sharp corners that must once have existed, now rounded and gentle. The doorway did not draw its attention to itself. It did not call out or beckon. It simply existed, a quiet presence in the quiet lane, waiting with infinite patience for the sounds that would stir its ancient, gentle awareness. The darkness within the arch was not quite the same as the darkness that filled the rest of the lane. It was thicker, more substantial, as if it had been gathered and concentrated, layered upon itself until it became something that was almost tangible. To look into the arch was to see nothing but shadow, a deep and featureless black that revealed no hint of what might lie beyond. But the darkness was not threatening. It was not the kind of shadow that hid dangers or concealed malice. It was simply a presence, a density of air and absence of light that had settled into the space within the doorway and remained there, undisturbed, for longer than memory could reach. The enchantment rested in this darkness, woven into it as thoroughly as it was woven into the stone. The darkness and the enchantment were not separate things. They were part of the same whole, two aspects of a single quiet existence that required nothing from the world except the occasional sound of a name drifting through the still air. The doorway stood, and the darkness within it waited, and the enchantment listened with its patient, passive attention, ready to respond in its gentle way to whatever names might come. Time moved differently in the lane. Not slowly, not quickly, but with a kind of formless continuity that made the passage of hours or days difficult to measure. The light never changed significantly. It remained a constant dimness, neither bright enough to be called day nor dark enough to be called night. The air remained still and cool, undisturbed by wind or weather. The silence remained profound, broken only by the rare, distant sounds that sometimes filtered in from the world beyond. In this unchanging environment, the doorway stood as it had always stood, its stone cool and smooth, its darkness deep and undisturbed. The enchantment continued its quiet work, listening to the air, waiting for the patterns of sound that would stir its gentle response. There was no sense of anticipation in this waiting, no expectation that anything in particular would happen. The doorway simply was, and the enchantment simply existed, and together they formed a small point of patient stillness in the vast, quiet city. The lane was empty most of the time, but occasionally, rarely, but occasionally, someone would pass through. When a figure did appear in the lane, moving slowly through the dim light, the doorway did not react. The enchantment did not stir at the presence of a body or the sound of footsteps on the cobblestones. It waited, patient and unhurried, for the sounds that mattered, the patterns of breath and intention that formed names. The figure moved with no apparent purpose, drifting through the lane like a shadow, feet making only the softest sounds against the worn stone. The figure's clothing was dark and simple, indistinct in the dim light, and their face was obscured by distance and shadow. They moved as if walking in sleep, or as if the act of walking itself was the only purpose, the journey more important than any destination. The figure approached the doorway slowly, each step deliberate and unhurried. There was no hesitation in the movement, no pause to examine the arch or wonder at its purpose. The figure simply moved toward it, drawn perhaps by some unconscious recognition, some faint awareness that this place was different from the other places in the lane. When they reached the doorway, they stopped, standing before the arch in silence, their breath slow and even, their body still. For a long moment, nothing happened. The figure stood before the doorway, and the doorway stood before the figure, and the silence in the lane remained unbroken. The enchantment waited, its attention focused on the small sounds of breath and movement, listening for the patterns that would trigger its response. The figure raised one hand slowly, reaching out toward the stone of the arch. The fingers were pale in the dim light, slender and careful, and they touched the stone with a gentleness that suggested reverence or caution. The stone was cool beneath the touch, smooth and slightly damp, and it yielded nothing. No warmth, no movement, no sign of the magic that rested within it. The figure's hand remained on the stone for a moment, then withdrew. The enchantment did not respond to touch. It responded only to names, to the sounds that carried identity and memory. The figure stood in silence, breathing slowly, and then, so quietly that the sound was barely more than a vibration in the air, they spoke. The words were not clear, not loud enough to be understood, but the shape of them was unmistakable. A name, spoken softly, with no particular emphasis, no expectation of response. Just a name, released into the still air. The enchantment stirred. It was not a sudden awakening, not a sharp shift from dormancy to activity. It was simply a gentle acknowledgement, a subtle change in the quality of the doorway's existence. The stone of the arch began to warm, the coolness fading slowly as heat spread through the rock. It was not a dramatic warmth, not the heat of fire or the intensity of sunlight. It was gentle, barely perceptible, like the warmth of a body standing close, or the residual heat of a stone that had been touched by the sun hours before. The warmth spread from the point where the figure's hand had rested, moving outward through the arch in slow, concentric waves. The air within the doorway shifted, a movement so subtle it was felt rather than seen, a sense of something settling or adjusting, like a sleeper shifting position in the night. The darkness within the arch deepened slightly, deigning texture and presence, as if layers of shadow were being drawn together. The figure did not move, did not react to the changes. They simply stood, hand resting lightly on the stone, breathing slowly as the enchantment completed its gentle response. And then, after a moment that stretched without urgency, the warmth began to fade, the air began to still, and the doorway returned to its patient waiting. The figure lowered their hand, stepping back from the doorway with the same slow, deliberate movements they had approached it. There was no expression on their face, no sign of satisfaction or disappointment. They had spoken a name, and the doorway had responded, and that seemed to be enough. The figure turned, moving back down the lane the way they had come, their footsteps soft against the cobblestones. The silence closed in behind them, absorbing the small sounds of their passage until they were gone entirely, leaving the lane empty once more. The doorway stood unchanged, its stone cool again, its darkness deep and undisturbed. The enchantment settled back into its state of passive awareness, listening to the air, waiting for the next name that might drift through the stillness. There was no sense of completion or accomplishment in this. The doorway had done what it always did, recognized a name, responded with gentle warmth, and then returned to its waiting. The cycle would continue, endlessly and without variation, as long as names were spoken and the enchantment endured. Time passed, formless and unmeasured. The light in the lane remained constant, the air remained still, and the silence remained profound. The doorway stood, and the enchantment listened, and the world continued its slow, patient existence. Occasionally, a name would be spoken, sometimes by a figure passing through the lane, standing before the arch and releasing a sound into the air. Sometimes by no one visible at all. The name carried on a breath of air from some distant place, drifting down the lane and reaching the doorway by chance or by some unknown intention. Each time a name was spoken, the enchantment responded in its gentle way, warmth spreading through the stone, air shifting within the arch, darkness deepening and then settling. The responses were always the same, always subtle, always patient. The enchantment did not grow tired of this work because it did not experience weariness. It did not grow bored because it did not experience desire for change. It simply was, and it did what it had been made to do, responding to names with the same quiet recognition year after year, century after century, in the unchanging dimness of the forgotten lane. The names that were spoken varied in their sound and shape, but to the enchantment, they were all equally significant. Some were short, single syllables that hung in the air for only a moment before fading. Others were longer, complex combinations of sounds that took more breath to speak and more time to dissipate. Some were spoken clearly, with careful enunciation, as if the speaker wanted to ensure the name was heard correctly. Others were murmured, barely audible, released into the air with a kind of hesitant reverence. The enchantment recognized them all, without preference or judgment. It did not matter whether the name belonged to someone who had been important or someone who had been forgotten. It did not matter whether the name was ancient or recent, whether it belonged to a figure of power or to someone who had lived and died in obscurity. The enchantment responded to the pattern of the sound, to the shape of the syllables, to the recognition that a name had been spoken. And in responding, it acknowledged the existence of the person the name represented, however briefly, however gently, in the quiet darkness of the forgotten lane. The stone of the doorway had absorbed many things over the years. The touch of countless hands, the sounds of countless names, the slow passage of time itself. The rock was ancient, quarried from some distant place and brought here by hands that had turned to dust long ago. It had been shaped and fitted and set into place, and then it was enchanted, woven with a magic that did not fade or diminish.
The stone remembered nothing consciously, but it held within it the accumulated weight of all the names that had been spoken in its presence, all the moments of gentle recognition, all the soft warmth that had spread through its substance. This was not a burden. The stone did not feel weight or weariness. It simply contained the history, holding it the way a tree holds the memory of its growth in the rings of its trunk, or the way water holds the memory of the land it has flowed through. The doorway was a repository of quiet acknowledgement, a place where names had been spoken and heard, where the act of recognition had been performed over and over again with patient consistency in the unchanging dimness of the forgotten lane. The darkness within the arch was not empty. It was full of the accumulated silence of years. The layered stillness that had settled into the space and remained there, undisturbed by the passage of time. The darkness was a medium, a substance through which the enchantment moved and existed, as much a part of the doorway as the stone itself. To stand before the arch and look into that darkness was to see nothing, but to feel as if there was something just beyond sight, something that existed on the other side of perception. The enchantment rested in this darkness, woven through it like threads through fabric, invisible but present, always listening, always ready to respond. The darkness did not change when names were spoken. It did not lighten or shift in any visible way, but it deepened slightly, gaining a richness and texture that suggested the presence of something more than simple absence of light. And then, when the response was complete, the darkness would settle back into its usual state, deep and still and patient, waiting for the next name to stir the enchantment from its quiet repose. The lane itself seemed to exist outside the normal flow of the city, a pocket of stillness in a world that had long ago ceased its movement. The cobblestones were worn smooth, the walls were softened by moss, and the air was heavy with the scent of old stone and accumulated dust. There were no signs of life here, no evidence that anyone had passed through in recent memory, and yet the lane did not feel abandoned. It felt inhabited by its own silence, by the weight of its own history, by the presence of the doorway and the enchantment that rested within it. The lane was a place of waiting, a corridor that led from one forgotten street to another, passing through the heart of the old city without purpose or destination. It was a place where time moved slowly, where change came only in the smallest increments, where the passage of years was marked not by events, but by the slow accumulation of dust and the gradual softening of stone. The doorway stood at the center of this stillness, a focal point of recognition in a world that had largely ceased to recognize anything at all. Another figure appeared in the lane, moving with the same slow, dreamlike pace as the first. They approached the doorway without hesitation, drawn by some unconscious pull, some awareness that this place was different. They stood before the arch, hand reaching out to touch the cool stone, and then they spoke, a name, soft and clear in the stillness. The enchantment responded, warmth spreading through the stone, air shifting within the arch, darkness deepening and then settling. The figure remained still, breathing slowly, and then they spoke another name. The enchantment responded again with the same gentle warmth, the same subtle acknowledgement, and then another name and another, each one spoken with quiet reverence, each one met with the same patient recognition. The names accumulated in the air, overlapping and interweaving, creating a soft chorus of sound that filled the lane for a brief moment before fading back into silence. The enchantment responded to each name individually, warming and cooling, shifting and settling, over and over again, without weariness or complaint. And when the figure finally fell silent and stepped back, the doorway returned to its waiting, unchanged and patient, ready for the next name that would drift through the stillness. The enchantment did not remember the names it heard. It had no capacity for memory, no consciousness that could store and recall the sounds that passed through the air. Each name was acknowledged in the moment of its speaking, and then it was gone, leaving no trace except the faint warmth that spread through the stone and then faded. The enchantment existed in a perpetual present, always listening, always ready to respond, but never holding on to what had come before. This was not a limitation. It was simply the nature of the magic, a gentle, passive awareness that required nothing but the sound of a name to stir it into its brief, subtle response. The doorway did not need to remember. It needed only to recognize, to acknowledge, to offer its small gift of warmth and recognition to the names that were spoken in its presence. And it did this endlessly and without variation in the unchanging dimness of the forgotten lane, where time moved slowly and silence was the natural state of things. The lane grew darker as the hours passed, though the change was so gradual it was barely perceptible. The dim light faded into deeper shadow, and the air grew cooler, carrying with it a sense of the night deepening beyond the walls. The doorway remained unchanged, its stone cool and smooth, its darkness deep and undisturbed. The enchantment continued its quiet listening, waiting for the sounds that would stir its gentle response. The silence in the lane was absolute now, a thick and heavy presence that absorbed all sound and held it close. There were no footsteps, no voices, no distant murmurs from the world beyond. There was only the stillness and the doorway and the enchantment listening. And the world continued its slow, patient existence. The cycle would continue endlessly and without variation as long as the doorway stood and the enchantment endured. There was no end to this, no completion or resolution. There was only the continuation, the steady, unchanging presence of recognition waiting in the darkness. A soft sound drifted down the lane, carried on a breath of air so faint it was almost imagined. A name spoken somewhere in the distance, reaching the doorway by chance or by intention. The enchantment stirred, responding with its gentle warmth, the stone of the arch growing fractionally warmer, the air within shifting and settling. The response lasted only a moment, and then the doorway returned to its waiting. The sound faded, absorbed into the silence, and the lane was empty once more. The enchantment did not wonder about the source of the name, did not question why it had been spoken or what it meant. It simply acknowledged the sound, responded in its gentle way, and then returned to its state of passive awareness. The doorway stood unchanged and patient, its stone cool and smooth, its darkness deep and undisturbed. The world beyond the lane continued its slow existence, and the enchantment continued its quiet work, listening to the air, waiting for the next name that would drift through the stillness and stir its ancient, gentle recognition. The night deepened further, the darkness in the lane becoming almost complete. The walls faded into shadow. The cobblestones disappeared beneath the weight of the blackness, and only the doorway remained visible, a faint outline in the dark, marked by the subtle density of the air within its arch. The enchantment rested in this darkness, woven through the stone and the shadow, always listening, always ready. The silence was profound, a vast and heavy presence that filled the lane and pressed gently against the world. There were no sounds now, no names drifting through the air, no figures moving through the darkness. There was only the stillness and the doorway and the patient waiting. The enchantment did not sleep, but neither was it alert. It existed in its state of gentle awareness, a constant presence that required nothing and offered nothing but its quiet recognition. The doorway stood, and the darkness held it, and the world continued its slow, patient existence. Time passed, formless and unmeasured, and the enchantment listened, and the silence remained unbroken. The lane would remain like this for hours, or perhaps for days. There was no way to measure the passage of time in this place, where change came slowly and light remained constant in its dimness. The doorway would continue to stand, its stone cool and smooth, its darkness deep and undisturbed. The enchantment would continue its quiet listening, waiting with infinite patience for the sounds that would stir its gentle response. And when a name was spoken, whether by a figure passing through the lane or by a voice carried on the wind from some distant place, the enchantment would respond in its gentle way, warming the stone, shifting the air, deepening the darkness for a brief moment before returning to its waiting. The cycle would continue endlessly and without variation, a small point of recognition in a world that had largely ceased to recognize anything at all. The doorway was not important, not powerful, not significant in any grand sense. It was simply there, a quiet presence in a forgotten lane, offering its small gift of acknowledgement to the names that reached it, holding within its ancient stone the accumulated weight of all the gentle recognitions that had come before. The enchantment would endure, patient and unchanging, as long as the stone stood and the darkness held, listening to the silence and waiting for the sound of names drifting through the still air of the forgotten lane.